Reprogram your mind to the 1% mindset. Inner Steel, YouTube script. Cold open, first 3 seconds. A man sits in a dimly lit room. He hasn't moved in hours. Not because he's lazy. Not because he's broken. Because somewhere along the way, someone told him that wanting more made him arrogant. That struggling was a sign of weakness. That the life he had, the mediocre, predictable, suffocating life he had, was the life he deserved. And the saddest part? He believed them. Maybe you've been that man. Maybe you are that man right now, staring at your ceiling at midnight, replaying every decision that led you here, wondering if this is all there is. It isn't. But the gap between where you are and where the 1% live isn't money. It isn't luck. It isn't even talent. It's this, the way your mind has been programmed, and whether you have the courage to tear that programming apart and rebuild it from scratch. What you're about to hear isn't a list of tips. It isn't motivational noise. This is surgery. Mental surgery. And if you stay with me, all the way through, you will never think about yourself the same way again. Welcome to Inner Steel. Let's begin. Section 1. The day you became average, and didn't notice. There is a man named James, who grew up in a working-class town in Ohio. His father worked the same factory floor for 31 years. His uncles did the same. His cousins were on track to do the same. And every Sunday dinner, without fail, someone at the table would say, "You just gotta be grateful for what you have." James heard it so many times that it stopped being advice. It became a law. A ceiling built from love, disguised as wisdom. By 25, James had a decent job, a decent apartment, a decent life. And every morning, as he knotted his tie in the bathroom mirror, he felt a quiet, gnawing horror that he couldn't name. It wasn't unhappiness, exactly. It was something worse. Invisibility. Here is what no one tells you about the moment you became average. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic fall. No single bad choice. It happened in the accumulation of small surrenders. The dream you stopped mentioning at dinner because people laughed. The idea you kept in a notebook and never acted on. The morning you chose the snooze button over the work. The version of yourself you slowly stopped defending. Neuroscience has a term for this: synaptic pruning. The brain is ruthlessly efficient. Pathways you don't use, it cuts. Dreams you don't pursue, it reclassifies as fantasy. Ambitions you abandon, it marks as threats to your stability and builds walls around them. By the time most men wake up and realize they've drifted, the brain has already started working against them. Not out of malice. Out of habit. The 1% understands something the rest of the world hasn't been told. Your brain is not on your side by default. It is on the side of comfort. It is on the side of the familiar. It is on the side of whatever kept you alive and unstressed yesterday. If you want to reprogram it, you have to wage a deliberate, disciplined, daily war against the software that has been running unchecked inside you since childhood. And the first battle is always awareness. You cannot change what you cannot see. So before you do anything else, before you change your habits, your environment, your goals, you have to name the ceiling. You have to look at the beliefs you inherited, the stories you've been told, the rules you live by without questioning, and you have to ask, with ferocious honesty, did I choose this? Or was it chosen for me? James, eventually, left Ohio. Not to run from it, but because he finally asked that question. He started a business. Failed. Started another. Failed again. On the third attempt, he built something that gave him a life his Sunday dinner table couldn't have imagined. He didn't find more talent. He didn't find more luck. He found the ceiling, and broke through it. If you're watching this and you feel that quiet horror, that invisibility, that's not weakness. That's your real self, still alive underneath the programming, knocking on the wall. Listen to it. Subscribe to Inner Steel if this is already hitting somewhere real. What's coming next goes deeper. Section 2, The Identity Trap, Why You Keep Going Back to Who You Were. In 1971, A psychologist named Walter Mischel published a study that would eventually become famous as the marshmallow experiment. But there's a lesser-known follow-up to that research that almost nobody talks about. When Mischel tracked the children decades later, he noticed something disturbing about the ones who had grown up to underperform. It wasn't that they lacked discipline as adults. Many of them had developed tremendous willpower in certain areas of life. The problem was identity. When asked to describe themselves, they consistently reached back, not to who they were now, but to who they had always been told they were. One man, a physician with 2 published papers, still described himself as not really the smart type. A woman who had raised 3 successful children still said, almost reflexively, "I've never been very disciplined." They carried old labels like armor they'd forgotten they could take off. This is the identity trap. And it is one of the most devastating forms of self-imprisonment on earth. Here's how it works. At some point in your past, usually in childhood or early adolescence, you received a verdict about who you are. Maybe a teacher told you that you weren't academic. Maybe a parent called you irresponsible. Maybe a failure so public and so painful burned a label into your nervous system. You tell yourself you've moved past it. You haven't. It lives in the language you use when you talk about yourself, when no one is listening. It surfaces in the risks you won't take. It shapes the goals you set just low enough that failure won't be too humiliating. The brain, remember, is a prediction machine. And it predicts your future based on your past, unless you force it to update. This is why so many men sabotage their own success. Not consciously. Not deliberately. But because their identity hasn't kept pace with their ambition. They've changed their circumstances, but they're still running on old code. And when the new life starts to materialize, when the promotion comes, when the relationship gets serious, when the opportunity appears, some ancient part of them whispers, "This isn't for someone like you." And they retreat. The 1% are not immune to this. But they've learned to do something radical. They choose their identity deliberately. They don't wait for achievement to define who they are. They define who they are first, and then let the actions follow. James Clear wrote about this in Atomic Habits. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. But before the votes, you need a candidate. Before the actions, you need a declaration. Who are you deciding to be, not based on your history, but based on your vision? Sit with that. Write it down if you have to. Not goals. Identity. Not, "I want to be successful." But, "I am the man who shows up before anyone else does. I am the man who keeps his word to himself. I am the man who does not retreat." Say it until your nervous system stops laughing at it. Say it until it starts to feel like truth. Because the mind does not distinguish between memory and vivid, repeated imagination. It responds to the story it hears most often. Change the story. Change the man. Section 3. The Discomfort Economy. How the 1% Trade Pain for Power. David Goggins did not become David Goggins in the gym. He became David Goggins in the moments he wanted to stop, and didn't. Before the ultramarathons, before the Navy SEALs, before the records, Goggins was a 297-pound pest control worker who was afraid of water. Not metaphorically. He genuinely could not swim. And he had failed the SEAL program twice before. The third time, he showed up in the worst physical shape of any candidate. He was supposed to be a cautionary tale. The instructors expected him to quit by Tuesday. He graduated. Not because his body was superior. Because he had discovered something that the comfortable will never understand. The mind quits long before the body does. And most people, when the mind quits, follow it. The 1% don't. They've built something called distress tolerance, the capacity to remain functional, even purposeful, in the presence of extreme discomfort. This is not a personality trait you're born with. It is a skill. It is trained rep by rep, the same way a muscle is trained, by applying progressive overload to the mind's resistance to pain. Every time you choose discomfort deliberately, a cold shower, a hard conversation, a workout when you're exhausted, a task you've been avoiding for weeks, you are not just completing the task. You are sending a signal to your nervous system: discomfort does not equal danger. I can function here. I can grow here. Over time, this signal rewires the threat response. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, begins to recalibrate. What once felt catastrophic begins to feel merely uncomfortable. What felt merely uncomfortable begins to feel manageable. What felt manageable begins to feel like nothing at all. This is the discomfort economy. You invest pain now, and you draw strength later. The 99% do the opposite. They avoid every form of discomfort today, and they spend the rest of their lives paying compounded interest on that avoidance. The hard conversation they didn't have becomes the broken relationship. The discipline they didn't build becomes the career they never had. The fear they never faced becomes the prison they can't escape. Look at your life right now. Find the thing you are most consistently avoiding. Not the biggest thing. The most consistent thing. The thing that you always find a reason to delay, to deprioritize, to schedule for next week. That thing is the exact location of your next evolution. The 1% run toward that thing. Not because they enjoy pain. Most of them hate it just as much as anyone else. But because they've learned to read discomfort as data. Discomfort says this matters. This is where you are not yet who you need to be. This is where the growth is. Go there. Go there today. Go there before the voice in your head generates 17 reasons not to. Because Goggins was right about one thing above all else. The most important conversation you will ever have is the one you have with yourself at the moment you want to quit. Win that conversation. Everything else follows. Section 4: The Silence Practice. Why the 1% protect their mind like a fortress. In ancient Rome, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius would wake before sunrise. Before the petitions. Before the Senate. Before the wars and the plagues and the weight of an empire, he would sit. Alone. In silence. And he would write. Not to be published. Not to be praised. To think clearly. The Meditations, 12 books of private journal entries that were never meant for other eyes, survive today as one of the most powerful documents ever written on the architecture of the disciplined mind. And what they reveal, above all else, is this: Marcus Aurelius was in a constant, ferocious battle with distraction. With noise. With the pull of other people's opinions and demands and expectations. And he won that battle, day after day, through one practice: silence. We live in an age that Marcus could not have imagined. An age of infinite stimulation. Of notifications and feeds and content designed by billion-dollar algorithms to capture and hold your attention, not because they care about your development, but because your attention is the product they sell. The average person now spends over 7 hours a day consuming digital media. 7 hours. A third of your waking life. Poured into a machine that gives you the neurological sensation of connection, engagement, and stimulation, while quietly, systematically destroying your ability to think deeply, sit with difficulty, or hear yourself. The 1% have noticed this. And they have done something radical in response. They have declared war on the noise. Not by rejecting technology entirely, but by ferociously protecting something the noise wants most: their silence. Silence is not passive. Silence is where your most important thinking happens. Silence is where you process what has happened to you. Silence is where your intuition, that deep, pattern-recognizing intelligence built from everything you've ever experienced, gets to speak. When you never sit in silence, you never hear it. And when you never hear it, you make decisions driven not by your own wisdom but by the last thing you consumed, the last opinion you absorbed, the loudest voice in the room. The practice is simple. Not easy, simple. 20 minutes a day. No phone. No music. No podcast. Just you, your thoughts, and a willingness to hear what lives in the quiet. In the beginning, it is agony. The mind, trained on constant stimulus, will rebel. It will manufacture anxiety, boredom, distraction. It will convince you that you're wasting time. That you should be doing something. Stay anyway. Because on the other side of the rebellion, something extraordinary happens: clarity. Not the surface clarity of a productive morning, but the deep clarity of a man who knows who he is, what he values, and what he is actually trying to build. Marcus Aurelius built an empire from that clarity. You can at least build a life. Stay subscribed to Inner Steel. The next point is where most people's minds get truly shaken. Section 5. The War on Average. How your environment is slowly killing your potential. In 1961, a young psychologist named Albert Bandura conducted what would become one of the most replicated studies in behavioral science. He placed children in a room with a Bobo doll, a large inflatable toy, and let them watch an adult interact with it. Some children watched adults behave aggressively toward the doll. Others watched adults play calmly. When the children were later left alone with the doll, they mirrored, almost exactly, what they had observed. Not because they were told to. Not because they were rewarded for it. Simply because they had been immersed in it. Bandura called this observational learning. But in the context of the life you're trying to build, it has a more sobering name: contamination. You are being shaped right now, not by your intentions, not by your affirmations, not by the vision board on your wall, but by the environment you spend the most time in. The conversations you have. The people you eat dinner with. The content you consume. The standards that surround you. And here is the brutal truth: if the people closest to you are comfortable with average, if they celebrate mediocrity, rationalize failure, discourage ambition, then every day you spend in their orbit is a day your brain absorbs the architecture of that life. Not because you're weak. Because you're human. Because your brain is a pattern-matching machine, and it patterns itself against whatever it encounters most. The 1% understand this at a level that most people find uncomfortable to hear. Your social environment is either your greatest asset or your greatest liability. There is almost no middle ground. This does not mean you abandon everyone who isn't at your level. It does not mean you become cold, dismissive, or arrogant toward people you love. But it means you are intentional, radically, deliberately intentional, about whose thinking you allow inside your head. Jim Rohn's famous line, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with," has been repeated so often that people have stopped hearing it. Let me make it visceral. Write down the 5 people you spend the most time with. Not who you wish you spent time with. Who you actually do. Now write down their average ambition, their average discipline, their average standards for health, for honesty, for growth. That number, that average, is the gravitational field your life is operating inside. To escape it, you don't just need willpower. You need a new orbit. Seek out people who make you feel slightly behind. People whose work ethic makes yours feel insufficient. People whose standards for themselves illuminate where your standards have quietly slipped. That discomfort is not judgment. That discomfort is the friction of growth. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. But before systems, there is environment. And before environment, there is the courage to admit that where you are is partly a product of who you've been surrounded by. Change the room. Change the man. Section 6. The Long Game. Why the 1% think in decades while everyone else thinks in days. Warren Buffett was asked once, in a television interview, what the most important factor in his success was. People expected him to talk about stock selection, about market timing, about analysis. He said compound interest. Then he paused and said, "I've been compounding since I was 11 years old." He was in his 70s when he said it. 60 years of compounding. Not 6 months. Not 2 years. 60 years of consistent, patient, disciplined decision-making, each one building on the last, each one expanding the foundation, each one adding to a structure so large that it eventually became impossible for the world to ignore. This is the most underrated secret of the 1%. They play a different game. Not a harder game. A longer one. The average person thinks in days. What can I do to feel better today? What can I consume today? What can I achieve this week? The 1% think in decades. What kind of man do I need to become over the next 10 years? What habits, if practiced daily without exception, will compound into a life I cannot yet imagine? What am I building, not for tomorrow, but for who I will be at 50, 60, 70. This shift in time horizon changes everything. Absolutely everything. When you think in days, skipping the gym today feels harmless. Missing the work feels forgivable. The small compromise feels irrelevant. When you think in decades, you understand that every decision is a deposit or a withdrawal from the person you are becoming. That you cannot cherry-pick discipline. You cannot be consistent at work and inconsistent with your health and expect the inconsistency not to spread. That character, like compound interest, works in all directions, up and down. There is a Japanese concept called kaizen, continuous improvement. Not dramatic, sweeping transformation. 1% better, every single day. 1% sounds insignificant. But here is the mathematics. 1% better every day for a year compounds to 37 times better by the end of it. 37 times. Not because of a miracle. Not because of a breakthrough. Because of relentless, boring, unglamorous consistency compounded over time. The 1% are not extraordinary in their daily actions. They are extraordinary in their willingness to perform ordinary actions extraordinarily well, and to keep performing them, without applause, without visible results, without the validation that the average person requires to continue. They trust the math. They trust the compound. They trust that the person they are becoming in the dark will eventually emerge into the light. You want to reprogram your mind to the 1%? Start playing the long game. Not from Monday. From this moment. Because the compound works in your favor just as powerfully as it has worked against you. You don't need to make a dramatic change. You need to make a consistent one. What is the one discipline, just one, that, if practiced every single day without exception, would transform your life in 5 years? Whatever your answer is, start today. Not tomorrow. Today. Because 5 years from now, you will either be grateful you started today, or devastated that you didn't. Section 7. The Rejection of Permission. Why the 1% Stopped Waiting to be Chosen. In 1994, a young woman walked into a recording studio in Atlanta with a demo tape she had made in her bedroom with a $200 microphone. Every label she approached turned her down. She was told her voice was too theatrical. That her sound didn't have a market. That she needed to tone it down. She was 23. She had been rejected so many times that the rejection had started to feel like information, like a verdict from the industry that was the final word on her worth. She stopped waiting for the verdict. She funded her own album, built her own fanbase one show at a time, created her own standard of excellence rather than chasing someone else's approval. Within a decade, she was one of the most critically acclaimed artists in American music, not because the industry chose her, but because she stopped waiting for the industry to have the only vote. This is the permission trap. And it is quietly strangling millions of men who are waiting for someone to recognize their talent, validate their idea, approve their ambition, grant them access to a life they're capable of building on their own. The 1% have buried the permission slip. They don't wait to be chosen. They choose themselves. This is not arrogance. Arrogance is believing you are better than you are. What I'm describing is something else entirely. The recognition that no one is coming to hand you the life you want. No mentor will appear unprompted. No door will open without someone willing to knock. No opportunity will materialize for a man who is standing at the window, watching, waiting, hoping. The gatekeepers, the ones who once held the keys to every industry, every institution, every profession, have never held less power than they do right now. Technology has democratized creation, distribution, and access to an unprecedented degree. You can build an audience, launch a business, publish your work, connect with mentors, start from nothing, from your bedroom, from your phone. The only thing standing between you and the beginning is the belief that you need someone else's permission to begin. You don't. And the moment you truly understand that, not intellectually, but in your bones, in the way it changes how you move through a morning, something fundamental shifts. You stop performing for an audience that may never come. You stop polishing the proposal for the approval that may never arrive. You start building. You start doing. you start becoming. Because the 1% figured out something that the rest of the world is still waiting to be told, the doing comes first. The recognition comes later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes never, and they do it anyway. Subscribe to Inner Steel for more of this. The next point is the one that separates the men who change from the men who almost changed. Section 8. The Inner Critic, making your harshest enemy into your greatest ally. In the 1980s, a performance psychologist named Timothy Galway published a book called The Inner Game of Tennis, which, despite its title, had almost nothing to do with tennis and everything to do with the war that happens inside the human mind. Galway identified two selves. Self 1, the narrator. The voice that critiques, compares, catastrophizes, and judges. The one that says, "You're not good enough, you're going to fail, who do you think you are?" Self 2, the performer. The part of you that actually knows how to do the work, the intuitive, capable, experienced part of you that, when left alone, often operates at extraordinary levels. The problem, Galway observed, is that Self 1 almost never shuts up. It is running a constant, often vicious commentary on everything you attempt. And its chatter doesn't just distract, it actively disrupts. The overthinking causes the missed shot. The self-doubt causes the hesitation. The inner critic creates, in the external world, the very failures it predicts. Most people deal with the inner critic in one of two ways. They either obey it, retreating, avoiding, giving up, or they try to silence it through brute force, which almost never works, because willpower is a finite resource and the critic is tireless. The 1% have found a third path. They listen to the critic, and then they interrogate it. When the voice says, "You're going to fail," they ask, based on what evidence? When it says, "You're not ready," they ask, what would ready actually look like? When it says, "No one will care," they ask, is that true, or is that fear talking? This is cognitive diffusion, a technique from acceptance and commitment therapy. The principle is simple: you cannot eliminate thoughts by fighting them. But you can step back from them. You can observe them without being governed by them. You can hold them lightly, the way you hold a hypothesis, interesting, possibly useful, but not the final word. When you master this, when you can catch the critic mid-sentence, name what it's doing, and choose your response rather than react to its pressure, you have done something remarkable. You have reclaimed authorship of your own mind. And here is the part that surprises most people. Once you stop fighting the critic, it sometimes becomes useful. Stripped of its emotional charge, its catastrophizing often contains a kernel of legitimate concern, a real risk, a genuine gap in preparation, an honest assessment of where more work is needed. The inner critic, tamed and interrogated, can become your sharpest quality control. The 1% do not have quieter minds than you. They have a different relationship with the noise inside them. They have learned to be in the room with self-doubt without letting it drive. You can learn this too. Not by reading it, by practicing it. Starting today, when you notice the critic, don't fight it and don't follow it. Just name it. That's fear. That's the old programming. That's Self 1 doing what Self 1 does. And then, with a calmness that is itself a form of power, keep going anyway. Section 9. The Discipline of Disregard. Why the 1% stopped caring what people think. In 1905, Albert Einstein submitted his doctoral dissertation to the University of Zurich. The committee rejected it. They found it too speculative, not grounded in established science. One professor called it fantastic, and not in the complimentary sense. That same year, Einstein published 5 papers that would permanently alter humanity's understanding of space, time, light, and matter. The papers that would eventually be called the Annus Mirabilis, the miraculous year. Papers that formed the foundation of modern physics. He didn't write them after the committee approved his thinking. He wrote them while the committee was busy deciding he was wrong. This is the discipline of disregard, the deliberate, trained capacity to pursue your vision in the face of judgment, skepticism, ridicule, and rejection, not because you are indifferent to human opinion, but because you have learned to distinguish between feedback that serves your growth and noise that serves someone else's comfort. One of the greatest lies told to ambitious people is, care about what people think, it will keep you humble. There is a version of this that is true. You should care about your character. You should care about your impact on others. You should care about the people who genuinely love you and whose lives intersect with yours in meaningful ways. But caring about the opinions of people who are not invested in your growth, people who are threatened by your ambition, comforted by your mediocrity, or simply reflexively skeptical of anything unfamiliar, that is not humility. That is sabotage wearing humility's face. The 1% have made a distinction that the 99% haven't. They separate signal from noise. They stay radically open to feedback from people who have earned the right to give it, mentors, respected peers, people who have done what they're trying to do. And they are almost entirely closed to feedback from people who are simply uncomfortable with the size of their dream. The next time someone tells you your goal is unrealistic, ask yourself, is this person speaking from experience, or from fear? Is this person invested in my success, or in my staying small? Because Einstein didn't submit a new dissertation after the rejection. He kept writing. He kept thinking. He kept building. And history, it turns out, is not very interested in what the committee thought. Section 10, the final reprogramming, the decision that changes everything. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna when the Second World War began. He was working on a theory, a manuscript he had spent years developing, about meaning as the primary human motivator. Then he was taken to Auschwitz. His manuscript was confiscated. His family was murdered. His wife, his parents, his brother, all of them gone. He was stripped of his name, his possessions, his freedom, his dignity. Everything external that defined his existence was systematically destroyed. What they could not take, and what he wrote about, years later, in Man's Search for Meaning, was his response to what was happening to him. In the most brutal conditions human beings have ever devised, Frankl discovered what he called the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. The gap between stimulus and response. The space, however small, however difficult to locate, where a human being is still sovereign. Everything can be taken from a man, he wrote. But one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. He survived. He rebuilt. He published a book that would go on to sell over 10 million copies in over 20 languages, and is still, to this day, among the most widely read books ever written. Not because he was lucky. Not because he was special. Because he made a decision, the foundational decision, that the 1% make and the 99% defer indefinitely. He decided to take ownership. Not of circumstances. You cannot own circumstances. But of response. Of perspective. Of the direction he would point his life in, regardless of where the world tried to push it. This is the final reprogramming. The one that makes all the others possible. You can have every strategy in this video, the identity clarity, the discomfort tolerance, the silence practice, the long game, the permission you give yourself, the critic you've tamed, the judgment you've learned to disregard. But without this foundational decision, they are all techniques without a root. The root is ownership. Complete, unconditional, unapologetic ownership. Of your thoughts. Of your habits. Of your responses to the people who've wronged you. Of the years you spent in the wrong direction. Of the gifts you haven't fully used. Of the man you've been and the man you're becoming. Not blame, ownership. The two are not the same. Blame asks who did this to me. Ownership asks what am I going to do about it. The moment you make that shift, genuinely, in the marrow of you, not as a concept but as a way of moving through every moment of your life, you cross from the 99% into something else entirely. Not perfection. Not invincibility. Not a life without pain or failure or the deep ache of loss. But a life lived on your terms. Built by your hands. Shaped by your choices. A life that, when you reach its end, whenever that comes, you can look back on and know, I was here. I was present. I chose this. I built this. I did not drift. That is the 1% mindset. Not an elite club. Not a score. Not a rank. A way of being in the world that begins with a single decision, one you can make right now, in this moment, wherever you are, whatever has happened, however far the drift has taken you. The decision to own your mind. To reclaim your attention. To choose, deliberately, daily, permanently, the person you are becoming. That decision is available to you. The only question is whether you're ready to make it. Outro. If this video reached something real in you, if something shifted while you were watching, then you already know what that feeling is. That's the part of you that hasn't given up. The part that has been waiting, maybe for years, for someone to say what you already knew but needed to hear out loud. Don't let it fade. Make one decision today. Not 10. 1. Something that the old version of you would have avoided. Something that the man you're becoming would not flinch from. And if you want to keep building, if you want to keep strengthening the mind, the discipline, the inner steel that makes everything else possible, then subscribe to Inner Steel right now. This channel exists for men who are done with average. Men who are building something real. Men who understand that the greatest project of their lifetime is themselves. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The work continues. Inner Steel.